Hello, fans of Cheese of Ages, and here we're back for the review of the fourth wave of playtest materials for Dungeons & Dragons Next. Now, in hindsight, I probably shouldn't have called the release of the magic item rules Wave 3, because Wave 1 was like the initial release, and Wave 2 was like a drastic, tweaky revision to it, and Wave 3, according to my titling of it, was just a introducing of an element and changed very little to it. So, but here in Wave 4, which in hindsight should be Wave 3, is a drastic revision, shaking things down to its very fundamental core, and, basically everything's different. Not at a fundamental level, but basically, like, classes work differently enough to be considered nearly completely different. They still fundamentally work very similar, but they're enough to where, like, you would choose different feats or something to give you a scale thing. Also, pardon me if I'm a little harder to understand than normal, or I cough a bit, as I'm a little bit sick. So anyway, because there's so much difference and so much that needs to be discussed about this new material, I'm going to go ahead and call this the controversial wave. I made actually some notes, so I made sure I didn't forget anything. So we're just going to hit these things verbatim and start going from top to bottom. I went into the read this first piece of the released materials, so I could make sure I could hit all the bullet point changes and not miss anything, and thus the order will be discussed at in a similar order to that. But anyway, you might immediately notice, in fact I'd be surprised if you didn't, considering they made a big deal about this, the playtest includes rules for playing up to 10th level, but for the most part it just amounts to the power of the first 5 levels from previous packets being stretched out to 10 levels. Some classes getting hit harder than others with this, and some classes getting hit so hard they are still nowhere near the former power they had. Basically, in summary, everything done got nerfed. In some cases it's good, in some cases it's bad, but we'll go over that when the time comes. Anyway, something I didn't cover before in previous playtest packets is that when they put in opportunity attacks, they made it so you always make them with advantage, meaning you roll twice and take the higher result on your attack roll. But they changed this. This is the second change. I didn't segue too well into it, but that's no longer the case. You no longer automatically make opportunity attacks with advantage, which I'm a bit torn on that, whether or not you should be able to, but in hindsight it's probably better that you don't have advantage when you're making opportunity attacks. It opens up too many doors for imbalance and unfavorability. Makes opportunity attacks a little bit too punchy, maybe. Anyway, next up, there are experimental rules in the book to make healing by resting not involve hit die at all, and another set that introduces bloodied to the equation, making it so being badly wounded makes it impossible to heal by only resting. Both are somewhat 3.5 flavored, but not quite as harsh as 3.5, and are nice for more realistic games. If you don't want to have any hit dice involved at all, just want to you gotta heal by magic, or you gotta heal by resting a long time, and if you're badly wounded or not, you're gonna need magic to heal. It's good for that. Not something I'd apply in every game, but if I was going for more a realistic, or gritty, or deadly approach, they're good, well thought out options. Okay, next up, they've pretty much added every 3.5 combat action to the rules now, including disarming and tripping, which are simple strength versus target strength or dex, their choice. So you need to make a strength check versus their strength check or dex check, depending on whichever they want to use. And actually, considering everybody can do this and it doesn't provoke any opportunity actions or anything, has no drawbacks other than the fact that you don't do damage, it might actually be a little too easy. But anyway, two-weapon fighting is also different. In the fact that you no longer require any feats to do it, and even more drastically, it's stronger in some ways but weaker in others. Instead of the stupidly useless previous version where you made 2 attacks and each one did half damage, which made it where it would cut, any additional damage you applied to it in half, it goes for a more balanced approach of decreasing accuracy in like previous, like in 3.5. You instead make 2 attacks with disadvantage on both, meaning you roll twice for each attack and take the lower result. And this can't be mitigated in any way, so if you are like flanking and thus have advantage or something, you don't just have a normal attack. You can't gain advantage when you're making a 2-weapon fighting attack, which we'll get to in a minute. And neither of the attacks gets your ability score modifier to damage. This is stronger in the fact that it's excuse me. It's stronger in the fact that it actually does usable damage, and if you add additional damage to it through whatever means, it will get applied to both attacks, rather than just being cut in half and being next to useless aside from minion sweeping or finishing things off. It's actually usable. It's weaker in the fact that you can miss more often with it. Instead of just 2 attacks, you're like making 2 attacks each with disadvantage. But all in all, I think this is a much better way to handle 2-weapon fighting than the previous form. But oddly, this is without feat support, as all means of enhancing 2-weapon fighting through like specialties or independent feats are gone. They just made it so everyone 2-weapon fights the same way. The exception is that since you can't gain advantage on this, you can't sneak attack with either of the attacks, which is a strike against the rogue doing it. Especially considering the fighter can use his maneuver that does damage, his equivalent to sneak attack, which is identical to sneak attack but does not require advantage to one of the attacks. It kinda makes it where the fighter is the best at 2-weapon fighting, which I'm in favor of, but it's just the sheer fact that they made the fighter the best at 2-weapon fighting by specifically nerfing another class doesn't exactly sit well with me. I agree that the fighter should be the best at 2-weapon fighting, but nerfing another class to achieve it is not good. It's not my cup of tea. Okay, moving on. Next change, stealth is clarified a bit, but it's nothing that's really new to Dungeons & Dragons, so I'm just skipping that. Moving on to the drastic class changes. Casters have been nerfed heavily. They have fewer spells per day. Some people might say too few, but it's 3.5 spells per day, so not the number specifically, but the addition. If you're familiar with spell castings, spells per day in 3.5, it's pretty much the same in D&D Next now. Some people say too few. But I haven't playtested it enough to see exactly if it's too few or not. It seems fine to me at a glance. And also, they've taken away horizons and cantrips. Instead of being able to cast 0-level spells freely, you have spells that, based on your style of casting, you can cast freely, and the rest take spell slots. I'm fine with this to a degree, and annoyed with this to a degree. Because, cantrips aren't just easy spells to cast, but it does add depth to your character by making it where if you're a specific type of mage, you do have these handful of spells that you can cast freely, but if you're not, you have this other set that you can cast freely, and and extra depth is not a bad thing. So all in all, I'm in favor of the change. And if your DM will allow you to select your own school of magic, like customize your own schools of magic or styles of magic, like your particular deity configuration, if your DM will let you pick which spells you can cast freely, like customizing your style of casting, then it's not an issue at all, because you'll just pick like the certain 2 or 3 spells that you want to use the most, and the only ones that you'll usually bother with, like light or something, and bam, no issue, because you get all the spells you want. Anyway, another thing that hit magic hard is gone are the spells that let you make a melee attack and add unconditional but non-scaling sneak attack equivalent damage to it, which is good. Now mages aren't just as good at hitting people with weapons as a fighter or a rogue. Another change, clerics as a whole got a little bit of a boost in the fact that they have full armor and shields by default, when previously only the War Domain cleric got full shields and armor. Instead, the War cleric, will be equivalent, gets martial weapon proficiency over the regular cleric, when normally clerics only have relatively simple weapons. Basically, it's similar to the 3.5 cleric in configuration now. You have to have a particular domain or deity in order to get martial weapon proficiencies, and otherwise you are, toting around heavy armor. I'm a little bit torn on this, because the idea of like some types of cleric being stuck with lighter armors appealed to me, but it's not all that big of a deal. Now, the rogue got somewhat nerfed and somewhat made more versatile. Some aspects of the rogue needed to be nerfed, but sneak attack, I agree that it needed to be nerfed. And he got expertise dice like the fighter in exchange. He got more tools. But, in previous packets, the sneak attack was too strong. It was nearly an instant kill. But to go from starting with 2d6 sneak attack damage to instead going, starting only with a d4 sneak attack damage, that's a bit of a nerf. And it doesn't go up until like level 4 or 5. So, yeah. And you can't do any of your fancy combat tricks and sneak attack at the same time, while that's also realistic because you like flurry. You're not going to be like precision. It's somewhat annoying. And the sheer fact that you're only doing a d4 sneak attack damage is questionable. And as I've mentioned before, the fighter can do the same thing without conditions. So why does the rogue require, specific conditions to get a weaker effect? I understand the fighter's going to be the best fighter, but to do so by nerfing another class is not really the way to go. One of the rogue's things is that he sneak attacks. He sneaks up behind people and stabs them for massive damage. Therefore, sneak up behind somebody and stabbing them for massive damage should be distinct from what the fighter can just like run up to a guy and do the exact same by hitting him. It doesn't sit well. Anyway, moving on to more favorable nerfings that the rogue got, is the previously overpowered skill knack and skill mastery have been made into maneuvers the rogue can use his expertise dice on, which is nice. Instead of having the equivalent of a 16 in every score for skills, and being able to take 10 on every skill no matter what, even without training in the skill, was being able to do that kind of thing was ridiculous. But instead of that, instead of like rogues doing open heart surgery with no medical experience while being attacked with a chainsaw, you instead get the ability to spend your expertise dice on getting a random variable bonus that is like minimum a +1, and can be upwards of like a 4 or more when your dice scale up. But still, it never gets incredibly outrageous. Like, even if you got like 2d6 or 2d8 expertise dice, you don't like, oh, I'm going to spend both, and I'm going to get me 16 to a skill check. No. You roll all the dice you put into your, towards it, but you only take the highest result. Mind you, if you're rolling d8s, that's still a potential +8 to the score, and you're increasing your chances of getting higher than a 4 by 50%. But still, it's not going to get outrageously huge like at 20th level. Whenever they ran around to that, like rolling 5d8, you're not going to get like a 40 to your skill check from it. It's good and has like, oh, you did this impressive skill thing with your feat of rogueliness without being, like nonsensically unfair. Like you can't get any lower than a 13 in a score before penalties, and that basically means you can't egregiously fail something. And a lot of DCs in D&D Next can be passed by a 13. So that was basically the rogue succeeds at pretty much every task in the game that isn't incredibly hard. You know, and it boiled down to like an analogy I said, you know, just being a jack of all trades is not going to keep your patient from dying if you try open heart surgery without medical training while a chainsaw is being swung at you. I'm sorry. Reality just doesn't work that way. Yeah. And all in all, yeah, drastic revisions. The classes work very differently. Clerics now have deities rather than domains, requiring people that are like having ongoing campaigns with certain things, drastically rework the things. And some of the specialties are gone. Some really good ones too that I really hate to see gone. Like in one game I'm running, this guy was playing a cleric. He was a knight kind of guy, and he had the necromancer specialty, so he would like capture the souls of his fallen evil enemies and, you know, fuel necromantic spells with it. You know, using fell magic with the intention of like, I've got this evil person's soul and I'm going to implement it towards the fight against evil, giving that soul the chance to do something good, kind of thing. And, you know, later he was going to have the ability to animate a skeleton minion and literally make the souls of his fallen enemies fight for the sake of good in an attempt to have them redeem himself. So, that background's gone. Necromancer's gone. You can't have a necromancer specialist anymore, and you can't have that nice, flavorful background of a knight that uses taboo magics in an attempt to help the souls of his fallen enemies find redemption before he sends them to the afterlife. I'm sad to see that go. Several specialties are gone that are nice and flavorful. As I mentioned before, 2 of them fighting feat sports gone. But they did actually flesh out the explanations of these things a little bit more. Like in my previous thing, Wave 2, I mentioned how I wasn't sure where you got feats from. And you could only get skills from backgrounds, but both were supposedly optional. You know, how can they be optional if that's the only way you get skills, and that's the only way you get feats? And it turns out they were the only ways you get skills or feats, so it didn't make any sense that they were called optional. But now they actually clarify that you don't need these things to do this. It's more of just a pre-packaged thing. To like add flavor. It's like, oh, here, if you want to have a knight, go with this configuration. Or if you want to have like a knight that's a guardian kind of thing, you go with these 2. You know, and you can actually select feats freely if you want. Specialties and backgrounds are now actually optional, rather than just being called that, but being the only source of, you know, skills and feats without house ruling. So yeah, all in all, while it will require more playtesting, pack just got out today, to see if everything is kosher, and some classes seem to have gotten nerfed a little too hard. All in all, it's a pretty good pack. Thing is, I wish they'd taken a little bit more time, and instead of being lazy, just reworked the sorcerer and the warlock, instead of totally taking them out. I didn't mention this until this very moment, but they took out the sorcerer and the warlock completely, rather than, you know, adjusting them to the new balance and saying we'll do something different with them later. It just comes off as a bit lazy, and considering I was running an ongoing game with my own personal modifications to the sorcerer and warlock in play, balancing them out, the fact that they are gone and now balance is completely different, I have to completely rework the classes to a drastic extent, to the point it's almost undoable. You know, it's frustrating. I mean, why couldn't they have just adjusted it? It's not all that difficult, you know, to think of something to have fixed the sorcerer, the dragon bloodline. All you pretty much had to do to bring it in line with the other classes is reduce it to medium armor, and, You know, instead of weapon proficiencies, give it natural claw attacks. Boom, it's reasonably balanced. It's still powerful and battly, but you still have to invest a little bit, because the claw attacks I have are like D6s instead of like D8s and D10s. But they're upgradable with points. I digress. You had to invest a little bit more to get onto the tier of fighters and rogues. With the Warlock, it was pretty much not really all that overpowered anyway. It was basically just a little bit of Rogue and a little bit of Mage. It wasn't really all that overpowered. Just, like, nerf a couple of little bitty things, and bam, everything's okay. Why not just tweak them to the new balance? But no, it's like, oh, you got this feedback, so we're going to take it completely the wrong way and totally reinvent the classes, and we don't have time to do that before the deadline for the next packet, so let's just chuck them. It's annoying. But anyway, overall, nice direction the things are going in. But I have a feeling the next packet after this that adjusts things will be drastic again, because some of these, as I said, are a little too far. And some of them might need to be boosted back up a little bitty bit. Some of them might need a little bit more down. Mages are more in line in strength. And everything's more balanced. You know, mages are here rather than here like they were a minute ago. Everything's like this. With mages a little bit higher maybe sometimes with right configurations. Arguably they can be like sometimes up here rather than here. But previously they're like this. So if you can tell the difference. All in all, good direction to take things. Balance is around the right level. Rogue needs some more tweaking, because getting nerfed so freaking heavily in the sneak attack department, to where sneak attack is basically next to completely non-existent as its own entity. You know, it takes one of the identifying things of the rogue. There should be some means of some variant rule at least that's in here. It's like, here, your sneak attack does more damage, but you have less fancy stuffs. You're less of a jack of all trades and more of a assassin-y kind of thing. There should be some rogue scheme that does that. But there's not currently anything that does that. There should be some ways to make sneak attack its own distinct thing. Because if you're going to have it, sneak attack should be its own distinct thing. Not just a weak form of smashing something in the face. Instead of smashing you in the face, I'm going to go through the trouble of doing the exact same thing, damage-wise, but it costs more effort to do. If they don't boost up the rogue a little bit and damage capabilities sneak attack wise, you can expect a heck of a lot of rogues when they implement multiclassing to take some levels of fighter. And even then, you can still probably expect them to take a little bit, because pretty much the only class that gets any like multi-attacking like flurries of attacks are fighters. In fact, fighters get an extra attack at 6th level, like in 3.5. Anyway, rogue needs a boost, and to make sneak attack more distinct again. But other than that, everything seems to be okay and kosher, but needs some playtesting to see if all of these little nerfings are too much or too little. Seems like it might just need to go a little notch back upwards. Like it took it down 4 notches when they only needed to take it down 3. But, anyway, this is Cheese of Ages signing off.